Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. I guess I'm not quite ready to go into retirement because I've decided to launch another episode here. Somebody that I had met within the past year that I stumbled upon and I felt like I really had to interview. Her name is Myra Torcheux. Did I say that correctly? Or
Yes.
I think the American accent could probably be Torcheux.
Yes.
Mira is a recent graduate of a master's program from the London School of Economics. She had reached out to me about a year ago regarding research on her thesis, and she currently has her thesis on the notions of justice post genocide in the Cambodian diaspora. In that process, I also found out that she herself is an adoptee from Cambodia. And as I mentioned on my social, I have been really passionate about sharing stories that I feel deserve to be highlighted and narratives that I feel have not had enough attention on. And I definitely feel like the story of adoptees have yet to really had their time in the light. So I am very, very honored to have Myra here on the podcast to share a little bit more light on that topic. Myra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for creating this platform for members of the Cambodian community, whatever, history they have, for them to express themselves and sort of relate with each other, and especially relay information that other people may not know or have. So I applaud you for creating this project. So thank you.
Thank you, Myra. Well, let's start off with a little bit of introduction. Myra, why don't you tell me just a little bit about your master's program that you have and that your thesis and what inspired you to study and get your master's in this topic?
So I did a master's in human rights and politics, and I knew before ever doing the master's that I wanted to write my thesis on Cambodia. The topics I sort of hesitated between multiple topics, it being either about NGOs in Cambodia or
Mm.
about specifically the notion of justice after the genocide. And I wanted to explore that idea because I feel like not a lot of voice was given to Cambodians. And also looking at that in general, there's just so much diversity and how it affected people and the journeys of everyone after the genocide. And after seeing a lot of engagement in the Cambodian diaspora and also being from France myself, living in Paris and seeing a huge community of Cambodians, I wanted to see the impacts of that in those communities. So I did it with participants from the US and France, and I just wanted to see what their notions of justice were. And that project was really important to me because it allowed me to go into like something that wasn't really explored, especially looking at the US and France, which were the two biggest countries that refugees um, and Cambodian immigrants have gone to.
Mhm.
So I thought that bringing clarity and sort of awareness to those trajectories and stories were really important. So, yes, that's mainly why I was inspired to do this thesis. And obviously, because I'm adopted from Cambodia myself, and I've been going to Cambodia every year since I was 14 with an NGO that now I'm like a bigger part of.
Yeah.
So for me, that was really important to delve into that subject.
Yeah. When you mentioned just now the injustices and the voices that didn't have a chance to shine during that period. What do you can you be a little bit more specific? What do you mean by that? What kind of injustices and what kind of in what ways were did they not have a voice?
I think that when you look, even not just, well, you look at people on the move and people entering countries that are not their own,
Mhm.
whether it be refugees, asylum seekers, or immigrants. Um, the experiences of those people who enter a new country aren't really heard
Mhm.
because the most important thing is to assimilate. And that's based on like the country's, the welcoming country's like politics.
I
And
see.
for you to survive as an immigrant in a new country, you believe that you have to integrate and assimilate in order to start a new life. And all these communities have different, traumas, different histories, different reasons for coming to that country. And there's different histories within, like between that country itself and the country from where people are coming from. Um, and so when it comes to them being able to speak about their experiences and the trauma that they've been through,
Mhm.
there's no platform for them to sort of express it. And it's only now that we hear more and more about it. But at the time, like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was no platform for them to express what they were going through and what they had been through, because the most important sort of project, at least in France, it's all about, integration, assimilation. And today we still deal with these issues with the, the income of refugees and
Mhm.
immigrants coming right now. It's a huge discussion in the country. And it's a source of tension in politics. And I just think that migration stories are really important and that we have to pay more attention to the people that are on the move because they are agents of their own lives, and their experience should be heard and they shouldn't just be sort of made into statistics and all
Yeah.
of that.
Do you think that's a so you're saying that's a government systematic issue? The fact that they don't
Mm,
put enough attention on immigrants and refugees and making and not putting enough attention on what their that process is like from like a government standpoint, right?
yes.
Mm,
Definitely in France, there's a huge sort of process of integration that's put into place. And you are sort of, it's assumed that you have to put your sort of identity of origin to the side and assimilate to becoming French.
mhm.
So I did a lot of research on that, and it does create tensions when it comes to religion, culture. And what's really criticized here in France is what is called communautarisme, which is communities existing within France. It's very criticized by sort of the right and sort of center. So there, that diversity of culture, at least when it comes to immigration,
Mhm.
is sort of disliked because it takes away from the Frenchness, the French system, the French
Right,
identity.
right, right. And I guess I didn't mention this before, but listeners, Mira is from France. That's where her parents are from. That's where she is currently living. Um, so you would say maybe then your career goals for the future, what would that really look like for you?
My aim is to eventually work in an international organization that
Mhm.
specifically deals with children's rights, women's rights, being in the domain of human rights in Southeast Asia.
Mhm.
Because I did also grow up in Southeast Asia. Even though I'm French, I only lived in France for 5 years. So I grew up in in East Asia and Southeast Asia. for most of my life,
Mm-hmm.
sort of in scattered periods. When I was a kid, after my adoption, then coming back to Europe, and then going back to Asia, meaning Japan and Singapore,
Mm-hmm.
and growing up my teenage years over there.
Mm-hmm.
So my goal is to kind of go back to Southeast Asia, um, and work in the human rights realm, children's rights realm, because there's so much to do. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I can bring a perspective as well that is very much needed, being myself, born in Southeast Asia, having lived there, but with perhaps a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I did my studies in that. So, really hoping to see some change, positive change happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's just incredible, and it's always incredible to see people who step up for the rights of these children and for the rights of these, Southeast Asian countries that, especially coming from you, who is a recent graduate, you have such a bright future in front of you. Obviously, you're so bright and smart. And so it's exciting for me to hear that and to hear that passionately from you.
Thank you.
Um,
Um,
So let's dive into a little bit of your past. We were in the process of doing research for your thesis, but in that process, I found out you are, yes, an adoptee from Cambodia. So which Cambodian adoptee center did your parents adopt you from, and just kind of briefly, what was that experience like for them?
so my parents, who were expats, were living in Thailand at the time, and for them, they had always wanted to adopt. At least my mom had always wanted to since she was a child, and she'd always wanted to make sure that she could enrich someone's life and make sure that they live a good childhood. And when they were living in Thailand, they decided that they weren't going to have their own children, but that they would adopt. And they tried adopting all over Southeast Asia. But as they went through that process, they realized that most adoption agencies were asking for money and they didn't want to do that. And coincidentally, one day they ran into a couple that had just adopted from Cambodia towards the end of 1999. And so they decided to start a process in Cambodia in the beginning of the 2000s. And so that's when they met me. I think I was 1 month old when they met me. And basically, I was sort of, they didn't choose or anything. It was just like, oh, we have a baby girl that just entered the orphanage, and we think that you can adopt her. And so, yeah, they had to stay in Phnom Penh, and they were adopting from the American orphanage, which I don't know the name of, and I don't think it still exists. Um, because with my mom, when we actually went to Cambodia this summer, and we actually wanted to go to that orphanage over the summer, but we realized like it was too complicated and that it didn't really exist anymore. So we sort of put that aside.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they adopted me when I was, I think, 3 months old. And I think it's also part of adoption processes that you have to adopt orphans that have stayed in the orphanage for 3 months. And also, all the paperwork takes a long time.
Hmm.
Um, and so after that, my parents stayed after the adoption. They stayed in Phnom Penh for perhaps 2 more months in a hotel with other parents that had adopted. And so it was a lot of adoptees and adoptants, um, sort of bonding on their experience and making sure um, because they were going through similar things and sort of seeing the similarities in that process and supporting each other. And then after that, I went to live in Thailand with my
Mm.
parents, which wasn't too far away. Um,
Yeah.
so
And I think you had mentioned that you were dropped off basically in front of the orphanage, and there was you have no idea who your actual parents are.
yeah, that's something, at least that's when I would ask my parents, or usually my mom, I would ask her. She would always say that I was left in front of a door in an orphanage in Kampong Cham, which is where I was possibly born, and that then I was moved from that orphanage to the Phnom Penh orphanage because there would be higher chances of me getting adopted there. At least this is the story that they've told my mom, and my mom has never really questioned that story either, because I think we're talking about a time as well. So to give context, in like the 1990s to 2000s, there were so many adopting parents, so many parents that wanted to adopt all over the US, France, the UK. And that's when the biggest number of adoptions happened, the
Hmm.
highest number. And parents were coming with, at least the majority, we can hope, were coming with very hopeful and positive mindsets of adopting children who truly
Hmm.
needed a family to care for
Hmm.
them. And so my parents, they really came in with that positive mindset. And so you don't really question the process either, um, which I've talked about with my parents multiple times since. But it's definitely hard conversations because when you do more research about this, you realize that that story is probably not true, because there are a lot of basically fake stories that were made up about the reason why a child was an orphan, and usually stories saying that this child was abandoned, which is also putting blame on the biological parents. So that's actually something, when you do research on international adoption in the global south, you realize that most of the stories that are told. But the reality behind that is that around that time, there was a huge market for children to be adopted,
Hmm.
especially in countries that had gone through their own sets of crises, civil wars, genocide. So just
Something
like
like the Khmer Rouge.
Cambodia.
Exactly.
Yes.
Hmm.
So definitely when you look at international adoptions at the time, um, there's a lot of questioning to do, and there weren't any processes or systems put in place to ensure that children were protected. There's actually a convention that was adopted in 1993, at The Hague, which talked about protection of children during adoptions. This is 1993, and adoptions were taking place since the 70s. And there are
Hmm.
multiple cases of corruption, sort of child markets, child trafficking that had happened all over the world, especially like Mali, South Korea.
Hmm.
And actually, South Korea had the highest number of adoptees. Um, in France, I think they adopted maybe like 70,000 or some. I may be incorrect, but I just read
Sure.
this book, which is about this South Korean French adoptee, and he talks about that whole system. Um, So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I would like to say that, like personally on my end, I had a very good experience, and I was very lucky to be adopted by the parents that I had. And then when you do sort of like questioning, or if you would criticism about the adoption process, it doesn't come from a place of, of hate or ungratefulness. It
Sure.
comes from a place of having to question those systems because they have a history. And a lot of adoptees have been badly affected by adoption, and I think their stories need to be heard as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like very heartbreaking, some stories that you hear
Yeah.
about other adoptees. But personally, I've actually met coincidentally when I was a teenager, the only other adoptees I've met were always Cambodian.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I met one, it was like we had like a special connection. Um, it was two boys, and they were at one of them was a French Cambodian adoptee that I met in my school in Japan.
Mm.
And we'd pretend that we were like brothers and sisters because we could both speak French and we looked similar. And then the second one was when I was living in Singapore, who was an American adoptee. So it was very interesting. And we all were the same age, but it just shows as well how prevalent adoptions were at
At that
my
time.
year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which was also one of the last years that adoptions were possible, at least from France. France closed their adoptions with Cambodia in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
I think they reopened at one point in like 2008 and then closed it back again. But on the part of Cambodia, they closed it. Um, they closed their adoptions in like the mid 2000s. So every country sort of closed their adoptions with different countries at different years after big scandals. And so in this case in Cambodia, there were huge scandals in the 2000s of child trafficking,
Mm-hmm.
of children being stolen from families
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sold off.
or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, sold off. Yeah, especially that sort of um, people don't talk about this, but adoption was a huge market, and it brought a lot of money in for a lot of countries that were offering adoption.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I was reading about the the effects. So there was more demand for children to be adopted than there were children that could be adopted. And
Mm-hmm.
when you look at the orphanages, most of the children who are like in their teenage years are children that have disabilities or that have um, illnesses, and they haven't been adopted. And yet, the bigger number of children being adopted are all babies.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that sort of shows you how healthy young babies were in demand, and that's how that market got created. Um, but also the adoption itself has shown to sort of impede any sort of social protection system to be developed in countries.
Yep.
So, for example, in South Korea, the fact that there were so many adoptions meant that the government never put in place specific um, social laws to empower and support families and being able to take care of their children rather than having them have their children adopted. And many mothers were told, you will have, like, your child will have a brighter future if he or she grows up in the West, in a European country,
Right.
or in the States, and you can't give that to your child. So the causes for giving your child up are social, economic. So there's that sort of power relation as
Yeah.
well between certain countries and the global south in sustaining that adoption process as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a lot that we just covered, but I think the main message here is that adoption, although, the adoptees are incredible, most of them, or actually, I'm not sure, you at least feel very, very grateful to be adopted by such a great family. But the topic of adoption in general is a very kind of nuanced one, especially in countries that had gone through something as horrific as like a genocide, like the Khmer Rouge. And so here we're looking at the country of Cambodia, who had gone through the Khmer Rouge in the 70s, kind of leading up to the 80s. And then the aftermath of that had led to the country, first of all, in this position where a lot of maybe Western countries are looking at it, and adoption at that 20-year period was such a high, which is, I mean, in stats, the number of adoptees looks great. But the behind the scenes of that is that the country then starts looking that as kind of like a profit, money
Mm,
making, corrupted sort of thing. There's this other side of adoption where now that babies and young babies are in demand, if a country does not have the system and social justice in place, then you just have young babies in demand, whether or not they
mhm,
are actually, you know, left and need help, or whether or not they've been bought or stolen or
mhm.
taken, whatever it is. And so, yeah, you kind of go back to to the original question of like, what your origin story was, and it's like, well, that's the story I've been told, but in reality, we don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
What age was it for you that you started processing the fact that you were an adoptee, and just in general growing up in some of the in some of your teenage years and younger years, what was that experience like being an adoptee?
So my parents were always very honest from the start, and they were always like, yes, you're adopted. And they would make it as like a positive story, like, you're our daughter and you were adopted, and
Mhm.
we love you so much. And very much like, you are our daughter. Like, don't ever question that. Um, so I always knew that I was adopted. And I had to very early on always have to say, oh, yeah, I'm adopted. So it sort of becomes an identifier for you. At least you
Mhm.
always have to explain your situation, because I'm here with two white parents, and it's like, it's sort of obvious that I'm adopted. But in other cases, when it perhaps isn't so obvious, it just
Mhm.
becomes something that you introduce yourself with.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was young, I didn't have to do it as much because it's sort of clear. But
Mhm.
as you grow up, you're not with your parents all the time,
Right.
and yet it's such a big part of you.
Mhm.
And it's almost like, oh, people need to understand that I'm adopted. Somehow in your psyche as an adoptee, it's something that you sort of have to explain. um and I think a huge part of like having to explain it is like, why am I so, culturally French? Why do I have all these sort of like mannerisms? Because like when people see me, they're like, but you're Asian, you're Cambodian. So for me, it took a long time to actually say I'm Cambodian.
Mm-hmm.
And now, well, having gone back so many years, for so many years back to Cambodia and learning so much, discovering so much about my homeland, um, my, culture of origin. Now
Mm-hmm.
I can say, like, at least when people ask where you from, I can say I'm ethnically Cambodian, whereas
Mm-hmm.
before it was like, oh, I'm French. But then
Yeah.
people would still question me about it.
Yeah.
Um, so I think the sort of journey of realizing, um, or it doesn't happen for every adoptee that they sort of have this connection to their country of origin, to their
Right.
birth country. I was lucky enough to be close to Cambodia when I was living in Singapore, that I
Mm-hmm.
could go back often. And also for me growing up in 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 Asia, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, I had that connection to feeling at least Asian, even though it's not, Cambodian. I had this Asian identity that I could come to terms with.
Right.
When I know a lot of other adoptees, they don't come to terms with their birth country, their ethnicity. They don't recognize being from there or
Mm-hmm.
it being part of them.
Right.
So I was lucky to grow up with Asian friends, Asian parents, all that. So I had that, and I think it made it less hard for me. But I did also grow up in France when I was in primary school, where I was the only um, colored kid because I lived in the countryside
Mm-hmm.
in like a village of like 120 people. And luckily enough, my mom was sort of known around the villages and the towns because she was very involved
Mm-hmm.
um, politically when it came to education, and she's sort of made an NGO to help children that had education problems. So everyone sort of knew our story, and
Mm-hmm.
I never really went through any issues of like racism or discrimination specifically. And even if I did, I think I was a kid and didn't understand it because so I was 5 to 10, and I don't think I understood that I was different from my parents,
And then
or
also it
different
was
from my friends.
right, and it was also very lucky, as you mentioned, because she had that political status and that kind of power within the community. Even if somebody maybe wanted to say something, they probably were smart enough not to, you know. And that is probably, I would imagine, maybe work in your favor in that kind of sense.
Exactly. I
Hmm.
think they, because she helped a lot of people, and so they didn't really say anything, or, I mean, I don't know if there's anything that they can say negative about adoption in itself,
Yeah.
or to me, they wouldn't see me as different, basically. Um,
Hmm.
and and luckily, a lot of people were very like socially aware and had enough awareness to understand that, oh, you don't say certain things to an adoptee or person of color because it can be racist. But there were some issues of like, not, well, they were obviously like, my friends would point out certain things about me because they were curious, but that in itself is just a reflection of how abnormal it is to have a person of color in that
Hmm.
part of France. So they'd
Right.
just be curious, like, oh, like why is your nose, so flat, or your eyes are so um in French it's bridé, which means you have, I don't know how to say it in
Big,
English.
big, bold eyes, or maybe different shaped kind of
Yeah,
eyes.
different shape. Like
Mm.
they would just point out the shape of my eyes. But in France, it can be it can be an insult. It's become like a racist insult, that
Mhm.
specific word. But it is also the word for the shape of my eyes. So they would just ask, oh, why are they like this? But it's not like I can answer, oh, like I'm like this because like just a lot of questioning that I did have to face when I was a kid, which did make me realize that I was different. And I
Yeah.
did recognize that difference, but back then I didn't have an issue with it. It was more when I was growing up in Singapore and becoming a young woman and realizing that I was treated differently than my parents.
Hmm.
And that being based on my ethnicity, especially in Singapore, which is very colorist and assumes people's identities based on color.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
mm,
So what would you say then was like your biggest challenge as an adoptee? Um what do you feel like was your biggest challenge?
I think my biggest challenge was having to tell my parents that I had a different experience to them and that was based on the color of my skin or what I look like,
Hmm.
because I was raised with this sort of color blindness, which
Hmm.
is prevalent in all of France. It's like we're a very colorblind country. You can't use the word race because that has to do with like the Holocaust and discussions of race. So that's been erased of our constitution. Um, so any ethnic statistic is illegal. You can't
Oh.
have any statistic in the country based on ethnicity or race. So never will you see people identifying themselves as Asian or um, black or white. That doesn't exist in France. What usually
That's
happens is, yeah, it's problematic, and you're seeing the issues of it coming today. And I actually wrote sort of an essay on that as well, the color blindness in the French system. But it's problematic, and it takes place in our language, and we only ask people their origins. That's why I perhaps used that word by mistake instead of saying birth country, or in French it's origins. And so origin means your country, like where you came from. But a lot of people are born in France. They don't have any direct link to perhaps their country of origin. Maybe they've never been. And so
hmm.
sometimes that's a sort of identity issue in France.
Yeah.
Um, but because of that color blindness, my parents also had that. And it was very hard to tell them, oh, but I'm being perceived differently than you. And so I'm treated differently as a result. They would always say, but that's not possible. You're our daughter. Um, why would you be treated differently? And and that was something that was very hard to explain to them. Um, but luckily with like BLM in 2018, we were able to have those conversations and they were able to realize racism is a real thing, which is sometimes something that um, like at least white parents wouldn't realize, especially when they're raising their daughter. They wouldn't take race into or ethnicity into account.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's maybe the something that has to be worked on in transracial adoption. Oh, yeah, interracial adoption.
Right.
There needs to be more recognition of that difference and how your child is going to be affected. Um, and therefore, you can't pretend that they're, white or no more different than you.
Right.
A lot of adoptees definitely have um, issues with that. Um, and parents will listen to that differently. I was very lucky with my parents who were very, like, they do a lot of reflection,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they've realized a lot of things, and you can have those conversations with them, and they recognize like their responsibility in certain things, not just with my adoption, but just like in life in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
You mentioned to me, that you have a very lucky experience because from a young age, your parents had put you through therapy, right? And they
mm,
had recognized from the very beginning that this whole experience for you is not going to be easy. Um,
mm,
as you mentioned, yeah, sometimes they might have not quite understood how people treat you differently because they don't get treated differently and they view you as their daughter, which I think only goes to show like how much they really love you, right? Because they're like, this is my daughter. Like, how is that
mhm,
possible? I'm sure there
exactly.
are many other adoptees out there who didn't have that kind of experience, and so that's really a blessing that you have been able to have that kind
Mm.
of growing up life. Yeah.
That's definitely something I reflect on a lot. Sometimes it's when you're adopted, as soon as you tell people, people will tell you, wow, you're so lucky. Um, and also they say your parents must be so kind. That's actually something that I always hear when I say I'm adopted. They say, oh, your parents must be so kind. And for me, in my case, like they really are amazing, loving people that I'm so grateful for. But
Hmm.
I think for some other adoptees, that can be not the same experience.
Right.
Um, so I feel that luck, and it's something that you 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 live with, and you also feel more lucky um, compared to like the other orphans that were in the orphanage, or to other children perhaps in Cambodia that could have been adopted that haven't been. Sometimes you feel that guilt, um,
Hmm.
which perhaps explains like why I've always wanted to work in children's rights. But what
Hmm.
I think is really like a mission for me is like you don't need to be adopted to have a better life. Like you can, if we work on social systems that make sure that children are taken care of in their home countries, and that
Hmm.
the issues that exist in those countries are, fought against and resolved, and those children won't have to be adopted. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so I'm not saying adoption is bad in general. I think it doesn't put all children at a disadvantage, but it doesn't give an advantage to all children either.
Right.
But it is part of a system which takes children away from their home countries, when we should be working on making their homes better for them, so that they don't have to be taken away from their families, and perhaps, child trafficking markets don't have to exist because of that. Um,
Right. I'd love to talk a little bit about your visits back to Cambodia. And yes, I think that, you know, the origin of where these children that end up in orphanages really come from can be can be we don't know. You know, it could have been through trafficking, it could have been through stealing or whatever it is. I do remember you, however, mentioning, now zooming back into the effects, the after effects of the Khmer Rouge.
Mm,
I remember you mentioning that on a trip that you had taken to Cambodia, you had witnessed truly what the after effects of the Khmer Rouge could be, especially on people who had survived the Khmer Rouge, women who had survived the Khmer Rouge, that really just truly were not in mental spaces to hold children.
mm.
Um, can you tell me a little bit about that trip that you went on and kind of what you experienced?
So yeah, so with the first time I ever went back to Cambodia, at least since my adoption, was with this NGO called Tassel, which I'm still a part of, and I joined it when I was 14 in high school. And so it's an NGO that has created free schools to help children in their education and give them free English classes because a lot of the times with the Cambodian public school system, they don't have um, good English classes, and sometimes for a lot of Cambodian students, they get sort of sponsorships abroad, um, perhaps in South Korea and China, and they can have some education that's better because the education system in Cambodia is still relatively bad and poor, but it's changing now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so a lot of the students that we help, they truly want to come back to their community. Some of them have had sponsorships thanks to their levels in English and obviously their skills. And they want to come back and become teachers or lawyers. And that's something that I really value and love about the NGO. And we also go visit families in very rural areas in Battambang, and we listen to their stories, especially elderly people who we realize have so much to share, so much trauma that they've been through. And there are so many grandmas living alone in houses that are really just not, it's not healthy and it's not a safe space. So we help a lot of them as well because they deserve to have, even if they're elderly people, to have their last years in a healthy, safe, loving space.
Right.
And
Right.
so, and a lot of grandparents are also taking care of their grandchildren. In a lot of cases, parents go off working either in Thailand or in cities to make money for the family. Or there are other cases where the parents have PTSD and for other reasons um, can't take care of their children. And so there was this one case where, and I remember it really well. It was my first time in Cambodia, and it was this little girl who is 8 years old, um, who had a leg that um, wouldn't wasn't functioning because when she was born, her mother tried to kill her because she had so much PTSD because she herself grew up as a kid during the Khmer Rouge in the children's camps. And she had a lot of PTSD with hearing a baby cry. And she basically tried to kill her girl and stepped on her leg. And then she died later. And so that's why also that little girl was being raised by her grandma. So for me, when I saw those cases of in these really rural areas, these stories of how the Khmer Rouge genocide has affected people and their ability to take care of their children and passing on that trauma to their children, it's such it's such a big part. Like all of Cambodia is affected by, PTSD and the genocide. And it's because of this trauma as well that women can more easily give their children away, thinking that they can't take care of them, which relates to adoption, or that if these children aren't adopted, they are raised with this trauma and sometimes violence
Mm-hmm.
because it's not being the needs, at least like health problems aren't being met, aren't being solved. There's nothing concrete that has been put in place to answer these PTSD issues. There were like many NGOs after the genocide that came in, put some medical support, did some research, but then they left because that's sort of how humanitarian agencies work. They come in, but then there's not that long term support. And they don't affect government policies either.
Mm-hmm.
And so today, that hope is that we can try to look at a better health system in Cambodia, at least, to answer to that consequence of the genocide, which many people have to live with, and
Mm-hmm.
in rural areas don't have anything to help them.
Yeah, you know, I remember when you told me that story when we had, discussed even prior to this recording, and I felt like just there's so many more of those types of stories that we don't know about. This unresolved PTSD of women who end up having children, but because of their unresolved trauma, um, having flashbacks and nightmares of what their childhood was like, and not and maybe thinking that it's better off that they don't have children, and when they do, the kind of emotional uh regret or whatever they may have feel when they have a child, and anything that comes along with that because of their unresolved trauma. And you mentioned, when the baby would cry, she thought of it as a threat, and it just reminded me of how during the Khmer Rouge at that time, silence was everything. Silence was how you survived. Don't cry in front of people. This is what I had learned from my podcast and interviews with my own father. Even if somebody was being killed in front of you, if your parents were getting taken away from you, you couldn't cry, you couldn't make a sound. And that's probably what I thought maybe that mother was dealing with, that was she was going through. She had grew up like that. And I think it's just it just kind of shows that, like, there's so much work that needs to be done. There's so much trauma that is currently affecting the second and third generation, and especially in these rural areas. It's different to be an adoptee like you, who was able to kind of get out of that country, or an immigrant like me, where my parents were able to get out of the country and I was lucky to be born in a different country. But some people had to stay in the country and some people had
Yeah.
to stay in the place and see and be within the location of where everything happened. um, and just kind of how that affects the relationship between adoptees and that whole global crisis, and how that increases demand and blah blah blah. So I just, there's so many different aspects to this whole thing that I feel like people are still discovering, people are still shedding light on.
Mm,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. How did seeing that affect you? And I'm sure that probably made you just even more passionate about what you wanted to do. But how did that affect you in terms of what that relationship could be like? You don't know who your parents are, where they are, but seeing that must have had some sort of an impact on you.
I for sure. I think when I was 14, though, I was very much removed in the sense that I didn't grow up knowing about my culture or my history. Um, I did know about the genocide, but very generally, and I'd never done a lot of research on it either. And it's not my parents either that could really inform me on that. It was definitely with the NGO that I found out because we do a lot of um, we focus a lot on the PTSD and how it's reflected in every aspect of life in Cambodia. And so with that, I found so much, like I learned so much about what really happened and heard so many stories, but I wouldn't specifically link it to my story, or at least perhaps I just wasn't making that connection, maybe to protect myself, because it can be like quite painful to think that perhaps like your parents abandoned you because they couldn't deal with their trauma, or perhaps like they didn't want you, or something else happened which made them not be able to take care of you. So there's, for me, there are so many possibilities of why I was given up, whether it be child trafficking or my parents actually not being able to take care of me, or just an intersection of all that together.
Right.
Um, but definitely after a few years, I did think a lot about it. And so for me, I would tell myself that it was because of the PTSD, and that for like, I probably did come from a rural area and poor family, specifically with my skin color. I can, there's sort of a colorism or hierarchy where people assume that darker skinned people are poor. Um, to some extent, it's like a reality in the demography of Cambodia. And so that I probably came from a poor rural area. And so that perhaps those factors came into place: PTSD, trauma, poverty, lack of education, all that. And so that's why I was abandoned or given. Um, but and hearing those stories, I would think about my birth parents a lot. But I do, in my mind, I sort of assume that they are dead. Um, I don't know why specifically, but I do assume that. And I've never really tried to go looking for them. But I think that possibly one day I would like to. But I also know a lot about like Cambodia and realize that it's possibly like impossible to sort of find them just because of all the the it's just too complicated, and there's no trace of it
Right.
perhaps.
Right.
So at the same time, I'm like, when I look at Cambodia, when I go back, I don't always think of them. For me, my biggest concern is the children that are there, the families, the elderly people, and how we can like make things better for them.
Right.
Um,
Do you think that being adoptee has made you stronger as a person?
For sure. I think that it's given me sort of like a unique perspective on life. I was lucky enough to have the the possibility to have the education that I had and be able to, for example, do my master's thesis on
Mhm.
this and be equipped with the education and skills to do that. And so I'm very grateful for that. And with my perspective as an adoptee and having kind of lived um, all over, it has made me stronger and more determined to, dedicate and contribute my life to something that can allow me to change systems or policy that affects children and bring clarity to certain, because I'm a huge history nerd, to like bring clarity to certain parts of history that have been erased, ignored, or hidden. So I think that's super important right now. And so I take my experience as something that I can give back to the world. So I think I'm quite lucky with that. And, I don't want to give, like, I want to make the most out of my experience in a positive way.
Well, I think it is clear to all of our listeners that you have such a bright future ahead of you, and that's the kind of mentality that's gonna propel you to success, right? Sometimes it's not. We can look at our past and we can look at it in two ways. We can look at it as a burden, or we can look at it as a gift. And I think the people who end up succeeding in life are the ones that take their past and turn it into something beautiful and use it as fuel and not as something that weighs you down. And clearly that's what you do, Myra. I really appreciate you having spent this time with me on the podcast. I really believe that anybody who listens to this will have a better idea, at least the start of an idea of what the experience of an adoptee is like, and secondly, again, the impact that the Khmer Rouge, something that happened 40 years ago, and how it's still affecting all different aspects of the country today, not only people within the country, but the people who had gone out of the country as well,
Mhm.
and how they've gotten out, and what those people are still dealing with. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time here. I don't know if you have any last words for all the listeners.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for letting me share my perspective. It's like this is the first time that I really sort of delve into it, and I continue to all the time, and you learn more um, every single time. So it can be a tiring, frustrating sort of process, but I feel like it's important to delve into like the truth of things, sometimes even when it's painful, because sometimes you can uncover something that can help others. And so I hope that my experience, other people can relate, other Cambodian adoptees, perhaps, um, because there's just, I think, so much that hasn't been said about the experience of adoptees, and specifically Cambodian adoptees having to deal with that, Cambodian past, or sometimes not being aware of it. So I hope that this helps people understand another sort of perspective of the Cambodian diaspora. I think I include myself in it now because
Mhm.
I've I love Cambodia. I love the culture. it's my birth country, and so we're all parts, we're all different like puzzle parts of the homeland, but we've been scattered all over the world. So that's how I see it, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. I am sure that people are going to get value out of this. And if I have any listeners who are also adoptees, please hit me up in the DMs and you guys can connect. I'm sure Mira would love to meet more Cambodian adoptees who have this kind of similar experience that she has.
For sure, I would love to have discussions. Doesn't have to be about adoption specifically, but I would be so happy to meet other people as well that have a similar experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mira, for your time.
Thanks to you. Thank you so much for listening.